I had a very inspiring English teacher. Decided, I think by the time I came to my ninth standard, I told myself I'm going to be an English teacher.
Having words like karma, dharma,
Used by today's generation, the Instagram differences, discrimination within the Indian society. India. And the subcontinent, but specifically India is ruling the services sector. The code language that are used by today's dating apps.
as we know, there were various significant personalities and saints like Kabir, Mirabai, Tulsidas.
And even older than Sanskrit, some scholars point out.
Something I will keep it as a memory after college like this. Hello everyone, greetings from Abhivyakti Society. Welcome to Abhivyakti's podcast. I am Shubham Manchanda. I am today having a very special guest with me, Mangalam ma'am from the English department of Aryabhatta College. It's indeed a pleasure, ma'am, having you on the podcast. Looking forward to a very great exchange of ideas and opinions from ma'am based on Indian literature. So, with that, we'll start the proceedings. Ma'am,
Thank you, Shubham.
yeah, please.
Yes.
So basically, ma'am, as we know, Indian literature itself is a very deep topic. Uh, I would like to know your journey. What has been your particular thought behind taking up English literature professionally?
Ah, I had a very inspiring English teacher at
Yeah.
school, and I think she was, I would give her full credit for motivating me to be an English teacher. She used to correct us very gently. I come from a Tamil medium school until fifth standard. I studied in the Tamil medium. So when suddenly we shifted to the English medium in the sixth standard, I fumbled in terms of grammar, speaking grammatically correct English, and she would correct very gently. And also, she used to share her books, a whole lot of her personal books, like the classics Alice in Wonderland, Treasure Island, David Copperfield, Oliver Twist, Little Women. She just place them on the table and she'll say, go and choose any one of them, read. But next Monday, I want you to write a synopsis, write a short synopsis about how you respond to the book. So that was very encouraging, and she used to appreciate my writing. And so therefore, I decided, I think by the time I came to my ninth standard, I told myself I'm going to be an English teacher.
Great, quite quite inspirational. Like you had that idea from
Yeah, so
quite
now I understand how teachers can play a very,
yeah.
positive role in students'
Yes,
life.
indeed. So, as you mentioned regarding Alice in Wonderland, you have got any specific favorite author or writer in literature?
By now, I cannot really say anyone
All
specific.
right.
Huh.
Okay. Moving forward, basically, ma'am, you're quite experienced, as we know. You have seen students coming from different backgrounds and linguistic, cultural backgrounds. So, how do they connect with Indian literature? From your experience, what's your take on that?
Indian literature in English, you mean? Yeah, Indian literatures in translation or in English. It's a great advantage because we as a nation, as a society, we are multilingual.
Right.
And most of our students also, come from different linguistic backgrounds, and they bring their own traditions as well.
Yes.
Even if they take a little more time at the beginning, they are able to engage and question and relate and compare with what they have studied, what they know about their own traditions,
Right.
their own language cultures, and then relate it to the English language.
Right, ma'am.
And we also study beyond the English language many other, what should I say, areas.
Areas and
Uh-huh.
topics.
So therefore, they are able to relate to it.
Yes. So, quite a diverse kind of narrative,
Yeah.
students, and basically, I've heard and read about your background. You've been into translation and you have translated various texts from English to Tamil or Tamil to English from different languages. So, ma'am, in this translation process, what has been that? Has there been any one particular complexity or difficulty in translation process from one language to another?
I translate from Tamil to English and Hindi to English. Both.
Right.
And when I translate from among the Indian languages, say from Tamil to Hindi or vice versa, I find it easier to negotiate.
Yes.
Despite Tamil and Hindi being very, very, drawn from very different
Different.
regions and cultures, there are still similarities in terms of how Indians communicate in their own languages,
Yes.
which can be easy to, transpose to other languages as well, other Indian languages.
Other
But when it happens from any of the Indian languages to English, there are lots of challenges in terms of the cultural nuancing. In terms of, we cannot talk without invoking kinship terms, making references to food, etc. So earlier, I think the 1980s and 90s, we used to retain, we used to translate those names also, the food items also into English, and that really created, very bizarre and fun, funny kind of outcome. For instance, if you have to translate idli, we used to translate it as a rice pancake, steamed, etc. That didn't make sense. So by now, later the translation theories also were revised. Now we retain the cultural nuances in the English language as well, and we leave it to the reader to challenge oneself to learn more about, right, the culture that we are studying from. But still, there are challenges in terms of capturing the idioms, capturing the proverbs, capturing the spoken vocabulary, and the way the language is grammatically structured in English and in the Indian languages, they are very, very different. So we can't do a mindless literal translation. It has to be reader friendly in the English language, as well as we have to be faithful to the original language.
Original one. It's basically like, as you mentioned regarding the translation process, do you think that original essence of a text in that particular language, it gets degraded while translation?
I wouldn't call it degraded. It does, acquire a different texture at times. But more than the loss in transmission, we gain so much. Otherwise, we would never get to know the richness of different linguistic traditions.
Very true.
So, therefore, translation is a great, gain for us, for readers.
Good to know your views, ma'am. So, with that, we'll be moving towards the second phase of the podcast. It's actually based on history of Indian literature.
Oh.
As you know, ma'am, Indian literature historically has been quite ancient and rich, as ancient as Indian civilization. Can I say that?
Yeah. All languages are linked to
Yes.
civilization.
So, ma'am, basically in this process, how can we make ancient classical literature more relevant in the modern day, present day India for the young ones?
uh, they are always relevant, except that if we are going to look at it only in terms of the pastness, then we find gaps. And since you mentioned Indian classical literature, I would like to use Indian classical literatures in the plural. We don't have just one classical, language, but we have many.
Multiple.
We have many, and unlike Sanskrit, for instance, which rarely comes to our mind, there are other classical languages which have a uninterrupted, continuity.
Yeah.
Right, like Tamil, for instance.
Tamil, right.
It is also a classical language, sometimes even older than Sanskrit. Some scholars point out, and it has been spoken, right, throughout without any interruption. So there have been linkages, there have been, in terms of relevance, and even for Sanskrit language, yes, many other modern Indian languages have gained immensely from the Sanskrit poetics and Sanskrit literary traditions. So there have been continuities, and the Sanskrit language, for instance, also talks about issues that continue to, impact us. It talks, it highlights gender, class, even caste, and issues of slavery at that time, issues of governance at that time, and the position of women, in that society, and the position of the condition of the artist, and the patronage that they received from the kings. So all these issues certainly continue to be relevant for us. In terms of, the Sanskrit literature has to be seen primarily as documenting the social cultural life of those times.
Right, ma'am. Good to have your views. Moving further, basically, ma'am, there is a question regarding the essence of English, or we Indians see English as a language imposed by foreigners. There's this kind of a narrative also. So, ma'am, at the same point of time, I believe that English has helped India produce a great, rich literature in the 19th century, post-colonial era after that. So, what's your take on that, on the positives and the negative aspects of English?
I don't see much negative, in that sense. English today is no longer a colonial handover. It is part of our culture. It's part of our social spectrum, and I think, as I said earlier, we all are multilingual, speakers. There's not a single citizen who can claim to be monolingual. So we do tend to speak many languages, including English. And English might not be our mother tongue, but still it is part of our, culture. It's part of our way of communication and expression. And it also acts as a bridge. So if, for instance, you might speak a different language at home and I speak a different language at home, but in the public spaces, in the public domain, or in our social interaction, English comes to our rescue as well as a lead language, as a neutral language,
Yes.
which is also which is a great positive force.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Good to have your views.
Yeah.
It was.
It won't be
Yeah.
negative since you mentioned the term negative. Maybe some feel disempowered if they don't speak in English. So to them, I would only say that any language is only a medium of communication. Whether you communicate in Hindi or Punjabi or English, the main purpose behind using a language is to reach out.
Exactly.
Right? So
It was.
if we look at English only as a medium, we will not have any reservation, including the inferiority complex that some of us tend to have.
Right. It was pretty nice, logical answer, especially the way you articulated yourself in this context. Ma'am, now we are moving towards the present day relevance from the historic significance. Basically, ma'am, if you see, at the same point of time, I mentioned about classical literature, having words like karma, dharma, moksha, part of the classical literature, how can we make them more relevant, or how can they be connected in the modern fabric of literature? Do they have got some influence to further connect with modern day readers?
Uh, Karma in Sanskrit literature,
Yeah.
and also in Tamil, other classical literature, they cannot be, what should I say, homogenized only in a strictly religious kind of, invocation
Yeah.
or implication. If you do that, then they will be reductive. Because today we are living in a more secular society. And so if you bring in the religious connotation, it might not appeal to us. Right?
Yes.
But if you look at them as concepts which are coding, which are codifying our conduct in social and in personal spaces, then we begin to relate to them. For
Right.
instance, karma is a very organic principle. It is not to be reduced only in terms of looking at it as cause and effect. That's only one aspect of it. The more important aspect of karma, as enunciated in classical literature, is to look at it as a very organic principle in terms of invoking accountability. So we become accountable to our action. And so we understand that what we sow, we reap. So it's not a mechanical thing, but rather in terms of linked to our action, linked again to our dharma.
Yeah.
Dharma is to be understood in terms of our conduct according to our role in family, in society, in governance. Right? So each one, whether it's an individual or a ruler, right? Or within marriage, for instance, the dharma of your husband, dharma of your wife. So in every particular relationship, social and personal, dharma is codified again in terms of our conduct, our responsibilities. So these are interlinked. And I think these continue to be relevant to modern day readers,
Absolutely.
modern day citizens as well.
Especially you pointed.
Especially in terms of accountability.
Yeah. Really good to know about that. Moving forward, ma'am, we have read about Indian literature. It's, as I mentioned, the historic essence of that. From the very Vedic times to the colonial times, there were some really good sets of compilations that were made. And even after that, the contemporary world. So, how do you perceive it, the unbroken continuity of Indian literature till date? What's your take on that?
That's a very broad question.
Yeah.
You want me to talk specifically about English literature in India or in general?
English literature in India, you can talk about specifically.
Yeah, in general, also, you see, Sanskrit has been a major literary discourse until I would say 9th or 10th century AD.
Yeah.
Right? And of course, Tamil is another. It has been also been a kind of a parallel indigenous, another homegrown classical literature. But let us begin with Sanskrit. Sanskrit drama, especially, has had a very, long impact on our civilization, on our cultural fabric. Since you mentioned in terms of the historical, impact, I would refer to Natya Shastra. primarily, and the Rasa theory of Sanskrit literature, which have enabled many of us, right, from various different linguistic traditions to emulate that in our own respective regional literatures. So the impact of Sanskrit literature in the classical period continued until the early medieval period. Right? And in the medieval period, there were many Indian languages which came into prominence, which
Right.
had gained from the Sanskrit literature. So that's one way of looking at the continuity. Right? And since there was a lot of decadence around the 9th century in terms of repetitive formulaic patterns of the earlier Natya Shastra based Sanskrit drama, that began to kind of go towards decadence, and the regional theatre or the regional literatures began to come up.
Yes.
And also, Sanskrit literature or Sanskrit drama in particular cannot be seen only as in a singular Sanskrit framework, because every Sanskrit play is multilingual. And so we never, when we say we are teaching or we are reading a Sanskrit play, we are not reading only a Sanskrit play, we are also reading Sanskrit along with Prakrit. So sometimes more than one or two Prakrits are used in the Sanskrit play. So we are already dealing with a multilingual framework, even in ancient classical literature. And this begins to then get carried forward in the medieval period. So when the Bhakti movement starts, these Indian regional languages come into prominence.
Right.
And they try to break away from the Sanskrit tradition, because by that time it had become very elitist. So therefore, the Bhakti movement in the Indian languages was certainly more egalitarian and moving away from the impact, but creating much more impact at the social level in various dimensions.
Yes, ma'am. Quite.
And that can be then duplicated in the modern period. Of course, the colonial period has its own different trajectory, which perhaps we can take up little later.
Sure. Quite deep understanding and deep perspective of yours in this regard. If I have to ask you any specific, if you are having any compilation from classical period, the colonial period that you really look up to, if there's any.
The colonial period brought in modernity to us in terms of within the literary domain by exposing us to English and also Russian literature at this time, and translations began to be done in the Indian languages from Russian and from English, sometimes from German, Russian via English. Right, since we were more at home in English by that time, and the impact of the progressive literature, the Russian literature on Indian writers, especially the novelists, the earlier 19th century novelists, is tremendous. And also reading the English, British writers, English literary writers, gave another kind of very interesting, enabling opportunity for our own Indian writers to use their progressive modern, ideas and use it against the colonial government. So we used English as a tool of, empowering ourselves and also as a tool of resistance. So we wrote in their own language, but against the British rule.
Right, ma'am. Uh, as you mentioned about English being the medium of communication in India, work and compilation in India. In present India, I think we have got some rich amount of original Indian literature of Indian origin. So, ma'am, in the long run, what's your view regarding exporting that Indian literature outwards to different parts of the world?
I think that began long ago,
Okay.
and it intensified since the 1990s.
Okay.
Basically, because that was the time of the translation boom, both in terms of theory and in terms of practice. So much of our Indian literatures have been in translation, but it became more systematized, more market friendly. It began to win more recognition globally, including awards. So in the 1990s is very significant in terms of Indian literatures being available in English translation and therefore in the global world. So that is another reason why we need to look at English a little more positively, because it's a very enabling tool for us, even to get global presence little more, strong.
Absolutely. So, ma'am, we're going to shift from Indian literature to the typical English literature now, just having an overview of it. Basically, ma'am, we have seen that in the 19th century, in the 18th century, there were some really significant works that were produced in classical English literature, like big writers like Shakespeare or Charles Dickens. So, if you compare it with the 21st century, don't you think it has kind of reduced that, comparing it to that standard of work?
So that's very unfair. That's very unfair to compare Shakespeare from the 16th century, Dickens from the 19th century
Yeah.
to the 21st century. The times have changed. Our challenges are different. And our writers, and that too, if you're talking about contemporary, immediate contemporaneity, look at the challenge from AI. Look at the
Right. So
challenge in
true.
the post-COVID era. They also face the pandemic. They face the plague. Especially in Elizabethan England in Shakespeare's time. That responses are were different because every writer, no writer, you see, Shubham writes in a vacuum. No writer, is a mushroom coming out just like that. He or she is responding to his or her social, context. So when we are responding to our social, material, political, cultural context, when the context changes, our response also is sure to change. But yes, there are continuous literary traditions, even in the Western world, even in the English language.
Right now.
But every tradition has to be questioned as well, right? Whether it is our classical, linguistic tradition or the early English literary tradition that you mentioned. Every tradition has to be questioned, has to be reframed. We have to depart from make certain departures of the tradition, but also revisit them, re-engage with them.
Right, ma'am. Basically, as you said, based on English original essence. Ma'am, my question is in this AI world, globalized world, interconnected world, where there are so many things influencing so many other things. Specifically in regard to English as a language, how can we maintain that originality of English for the future generation? Uh,
I don't know what exactly you have in mind when you say originality of English. Um, every language, including English, and this, as I said, every language is a very dynamic. It has a very dynamic aspect. It keeps changing. If a language does not change, it becomes a dead language. So, and if a language does not accommodate the spoken language, and every decade the spoken language changes, the spoken vocabulary changes. You would have seen that every year we have this new terms being included in the Oxford Dictionary or in the Webster's or in other domains, and they now begin to use many of the phrases used by today's generation, the Instagram,
Right.
lingo, the other, the Twitter lingo. And also all your, some of it I can't even make out. So I also need a special, dictionary to understand. But it's not just, the code language that are used by today's dating apps, by today's generation. They all get slowly assimilated into the literary domain sooner or later. Initially, we resist. We say, "Oh, this is not, grammatical enough. This is not literary enough. This is not English enough." But then English itself begins to change. So then we begin to accept that.
So
Right?
you see it as a positive.
It is inevitable. We better accept it.
Okay, that's good.
Changes in the language patterns and in the vocabulary and the registers, and also in terms of how we look at a language, they change.
Right.
If we don't change, then that language will not be available to us anymore.
Will become rigid.
Yes.
Yes.
It will become a dead language.
Dead language.
We are quite often we agonize. Why is Sanskrit a dead language? Because we made it so rigid and, we refuse to let it evolve, as a spoken
Yes.
language. So when we don't let it evolve as a spoken language, it gets confined as an elitist language. And how long are the elites going to rule over us? So the language also gets dead with them.
Good to know your views, ma'am. Coming back to India, about English only. Ma'am, in the long run, how can we fix the mindset of Indians regarding having that specific negligence towards English? Because there are many Indians who ignore English and they say that it's not fair for India's educational and cultural growth. So, but I think it's important to practice it in this world of 21st era. What's your view on it collectively?
Yeah, I agree with you. There are two ways of looking at it. One is to be very chauvinistic and say, oh, English is a foreign language, which is ridiculous. It is not a foreign language anymore, right? So we have been using it for more than 250 years. So it is part of our, once we accept it as one of the Indian languages, the problem is resolved. One. The second is to, even if you look at it in terms of having an alien root initially to that, we can still look at it in the present, as was mentioned, a globalized world. English is very essential in terms of our employment, in terms of our communication with the outside world, and we have actually managed to be at the top in the service sector. If China is, what should I say, ruling the manufacturing sector, India and the subcontinent, but specifically India is ruling the services sector because we are able to, communicate very well in English, both in the written and in the spoken. So we need to hold on to this hegemony.
Good to know your views, ma'am, again. All right, ma'am, moving forward from Sanskrit, chronologically, we'll proceed towards the medieval era.
Yeah.
And in the medieval era, as we know, there were various significant personalities and saints like Kabir, Mirabai, Tulsidas. So, ma'am, what's your view on that? Did they shape people's mind more than the rulers did?
Oh, yes, of course they did. They made a very powerful impact because they were, but there is one minor, variation to your, that I would like to respond. The rulers of those times, during, during Kabir or Tulsidas or Mirabai or even during Nanak before, they were not directly confronting these poets. Many of them offered patronage. Many of them, were also followers. They gave a lot of respect to them. But these poets that you mentioned, these saint poets, they were specifically focusing on restructuring our society, our Hindu society of those times, and they wanted to reform. And especially they were much pained and much critical of the prevalence of the caste system and the prevalence of differences, discrimination within the Indian society, within
Right.
our own people. So they were focusing on that. So they were reform movements, and they brought in a very strong bhakti movement in terms of, and also tried to question that there should be no middle men, so to say, the priestly class, to stop the lowest of the person in terms of social hierarchy, the marginalized also should have equal access to, to be close to the divinity. So this kind of inclusivity that they try to bring in, this kind of integrating of society was something that did not directly impact the rulers. So this was a social, reach journey which
Yeah.
benefited us greatly. And this also helped us in strengthening our languages. Because these poets, since we were talking from Sanskrit and I talked about how it decayed, it went into decadence, sorry. And this was a time in the Bhakti movement which came up in multiple languages. And this was a time which also strengthened the Hindi language as we speak now, the Kari Hui. So this acted in terms of strengthening our own modern Indian languages. I'm making this comment strictly within the linguistic domain. Of course, there are various other perspectives added to this. But otherwise, primarily in terms of language enrichment, the Bhakti movement also was a very, impactful period.
Right now. Okay, so just
And then from here, we go to the colonial period. So where English again makes another important linguistic, intervention and also an enrichment of our respective languages through translation.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Again, in conclusion, I would like to thank all of you, especially ma'am, for joining, taking the time out from your busy schedule and coming up for this. It was an honor to talk to you. And personally, I will cherish it for a long time, even after college life. And I think it was quite insightful, not only for English students, but specifically anyone who has interest in Indian literature or English as a language. So, with that, again, I would like to end. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you very much.
Shubham, and thank you, everyone.